Thank you so much. That is so meaningful to me. When I was searching for people to name, when I was searching for inspiration to name my first child, I remember weighing whether the name Clarence had been so tainted by a more well-known one, but it was really the only public figure I considered naming him after, although we ended up giving him a family name. So really, it just means so much to me. And I have to apologize after the last speaker. There's not going to be as much that's funny in my presentation. So as you just heard, my first book, Kingdom Coming: The Rise of Christian Nationalism, is 18 years old. I started working on it 20 years old. When I started writing it, Christian nationalism wasn't a buzzword. It was something I had to explain every time I spoke about it. And I'd become aware of the strength of that movement, or the kind of growing strength of that movement, during another presidential election. It was 2004, and George W. Bush was running for re-election against John Kerry, and I was in Ohio. And something you kept hearing from Democrats in Ohio was, where are they? Like, where is the ground game? They were out on the streets going door to door, and they just didn't see the Republican operation. And it made them both nervous and cocky at the same time. But where they were was in the churches. And I had seen that, although I wasn't entirely sure what to make of it, but I had started going to mega churches in Ohio, seeing both the way that they were railing against the kind of abomination of gay marriage, tying that to a Get Out the Vote program, and doing a lot of this organizing right inside of the churches. And so that became, once George W. Bush won, and won on the strength, according to at least one survey, of quote-unquote moral issues, I said, I want to kind of go deeper into this movement and also understand why so many people had missed it in 2004. So here's how I described the movement at the time. The United States has always been a pious country, given to bursts of spiritual fervor. But Christian nationalism is qualitatively different from earlier religious revivals. Like America's past Great Awakenings, the Christian nationalist movement claims that the Bible is absolutely and literally true. But it goes much further, extrapolating a total political program from that truth and yoking that program to a political party. It is a conflation of scripture and politics that sees America's triumphs as confirmation of the truth of the Christian religion, and America's struggles as part of a cosmic contest between God and the devil. It claims supernatural sanction for its campaign of national renewal, and speaks rapturously about vanquishing the millions of Americans who would stand in its way. And the motivating dream, then and now, of Christian nationalism is a restored Christian nation. And that doesn't mean that me or you wouldn't get to live here anymore, but it does mean that we would be expected to know our place. 20 years later, the description of the movement largely holds up, but a lot has changed. Today, the movement is far larger, far more apocalyptic, and far angrier. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happened and how it's come closer to power than ever before. So today's Christian nationalist movement, like the one I wrote about, has several antecedents. The most significant are the Depression-era fundamentalist preachers and Nazi sympathizers, Gerald B. Winrod and Gerald L.K. Smith. They railed against communism, modernism, and big government, and, in Winrod's case, Darwinism, and peddled a right-wing gospel conflating Christianity and patriotism. Smith founded a group called the Christian Nationalist Crusade, whose magazine, The Cross and the Flag, claimed Christian character is the basis of all real Americanism, And as John Gantz writes in his great new book, When the Clock Broke, Smith became the chief propagandist for the populist authoritarian Huey Long, whose third-party presidential campaign against FDR prefigured Trumpism in many important ways. Now, the movement also has its roots in the John Birch Society, which was a paranoid, ultra-right, anti-communist movement founded in the late 50s that saw liberals as traitors seeking to replace the nations of the West with one world socialist government. And something you might have noticed if you follow if you follow kind of the trajectory of the Republican Party is the degree to which Bircher language, especially about communists, the complete conflation of liberalism and communism and the conviction that there is some dark conspiracy in the Democratic Party kind of against all that is good and holy and against the future of the Republic has just become it's become so much a part of Republican rhetoric that we almost don't notice it. But even 10 years ago, this was quite striking. And it really kind of comes straight from the John Birch Society, which was a movement that at one point some on the right had tried to marginalize, most famously William F. Buckley, I think not because he saw it as beyond the pale, but because he saw it as bad PR. He basically saw it as something that allowed conservatism to be dismissed, but has now very much that there kind of are no more lines in this conservative movement in this Republican Party, and so it's come roaring back. Some of you might know the Left Behind books. They were popular they were popular when I was writing Kingdom Coming. They're these novels that kind of imagine in salacious and pornographic detail the tribulations that all of us will experience after the rapture when we are left behind to gasp at how right all the people who are gone were. And so, but Tim LaHaye is someone who got his start as a John Birch organizer. But the movement that we know as the Christian right, the sort of substrate of today's Christian nationalism, was born in the late 70s when a group of right-wing strategists and veterans of the Barry Goldwater campaign recruited a somewhat obscure Baptist televangelist named Jerry Falwell to found the Moral Majority. And they wanted to use issues like abortion to split traditionalists from the Democratic Party, traditionalists who were unnerved by the social upheavals of the 60s and 70s. And they wanted to harness the energy of this nascent evangelical awakening to the Republican Party. Because remember, there did not used to be this natural connection between being born again and being conservative. I mean, our first born again president in modern times was Jimmy Carter. So in 1988, the televangelist and media mogul Pat Robertson, who's the son, incidentally, of a Virginia Democratic senator who was virulently opposed to the civil rights movement, ran for president. And he's important in the story I'm telling here for two reasons, and I hope you'll let me go a little bit down a kind of theological rabbit hole, a little ways down a theological rabbit hole here. But Robertson brought an idea called Dominionism into the center of evangelical politics. And Dominionism is really key for understanding how the movement is operating today. So Dominionism derives from an explicitly theocratic sect called Christian Reconstructionism, which advocates replacing American civil law with Old Testament biblical law, including the death penalty for crimes like homosexuality and apostasy, and even in some cases, disobedience to your parents. And so you can imagine that even among the very far right, the appeal of this movement is quite limited. It's kind of strict, joyless, Calvinist, quite different from a Christian right that loves rock music and signs and wonders, and kind of has become increasingly enmeshed with Hollywood production values. But its political philosophy Dominionism has kind of pervaded the broader Christian right. So Dominionism bases its claims on the passage in Genesis where God creates Adam and Eve and gives them dominion over the earth. When man fell and was expelled from the Garden of Eden, their dominion was forfeited. But for those who are saved, dominion is restored, which means that God has given Christians the right to rule. So Robertson appropriated this idea. The Lord intends his people to exercise dominion in his name, he told Christianity Today. And he said that while he disagrees with some Reconstructionist theology, I admire many of these teachings because they are in line with Scripture. So in 1984, he told delegates to an evangelical convention that they had to get ready to take over every aspect of secular society. What do all of us do? We get ready to take dominion, he said, predicting the changes were 5 years away. It is all going to be ours. I'm talking about all of it. Everything that you would say is a good part of the secular world. Every means of communication, the news, the television, the radio, the cinema, the arts, the government, the finance, it's going to be ours. God's going to give it to his people. We should prepare to reign and rule with Jesus Christ. So Dominionism was the impetus behind his presidential run. And while that run failed, his followers learned a huge amount about political organizing. They learned about kind of how to work within the grassroots of the party structure. And the remnants of that campaign formed the foundation of the Christian Coalition, which was founded in 1989. And the Christian Coalition, kind of unlike the moral majority, focused on grassroots politics in a way that might sound familiar to you if you followed kind of school board fights over book banning or gender, or trans rights or tampons in gender-neutral bathrooms. So it would train activists on the local level so that they would become Republican delegates, they'd run in school board races, they would transform politics from the bottom up. I would rather have 1,000 school board members than one president and no school board members, said Ralph Reed, who was the former president of the Christian Coalition. So when I wrote my book, it was really a high point of this movement, right? George W. Bush was very much one of their own. He was reelected with their help. 22% of voters in one exit poll said that moral values were their chief concern, which was more than Iraq at a time when that war had just started, at a time when it became very obvious, I think, to almost all observers that that war, which was always misconceived, was going really horribly wrong. Patrick Henry University, which is a university that was founded to basically take homeschooled kids and train them so that they would be able to take their place in all sorts of elite institutions, provided, it was a tiny, tiny school, it provided 7% of the George W. Bush's White House's interns. And so it's not that the movement was always optimistic, because this is, it's kind of by nature an apocalyptic movement. But it did have swagger. Patrick Henry College's founder founded an organization called the Joshua Generation. And the idea behind the Joshua Generation is that the previous generation was the Moses generation that was going to lead them out of the bondage of Egypt, which in this analogy is like this is secular society. And Joshua is the generation that's going to conquer it. And they really believed that they were on their way. And then from the movement's perspective, everything started to go wrong. Right? Barack Obama was elected and reelected. Church attendance and Christian identification declined, and the number of people who said that they had no religion increased. In 2015, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage. Going into the 2016 election, it seemed like Hillary Clinton, who was, in many ways the incarnation of demonic evil for many people in this movement, seemed like she was going to be president. putting the Supreme Court out of reach for a generation. And so we all know what happened next. Now, Trump has reinvigorated this movement, but he's also transformed it the way that he's transformed the conservative movement more broadly. So if you look at what Trump has done to the Republican Party, right, the way he's dethroned kind of quasi-serious figures like Paul Ryan and Dick Cheney, who, for all their many sins, at least shared, I think, in the Venn diagram of overlapping realities, there was at least some maybe common ground. So he dethrones them and he elevates people who had been kind of kooks, right? People who had been considered marginal. Steve Bannon and Alex Jones now have far more influence than in the Republican Party than the former vice president of the United States or the former nominee for vice president of the United States. And he did something similar. Donald Trump did something quite similar in the religious realm. And this is, I think, a hard thing to get across because it's not as if, Pat Robertson and his ilk and the people I wrote about in Kingdom Coming are, sober, responsible, rational figures. But they really are compared to the new generation. So basically, the ex-president elevated a class of faith healers, prosperity gospel preachers, and roadshow revivalists that really appalled a lot of the quote-unquote respectable evangelicals who had clustered around George W. Bush. So you'll remember that initially, many of the kind of mainstream leaders of the Christian right hadn't liked Donald Trump for obvious reasons. They didn't see him as one of their own. They wanted a Ted Cruz or a Mike Huckabee. But there was one group that gravitated to Trump from the start. And they were these kind of independent, charismatic preachers and prophets and self-styled apostles. It's a part of Christianity that exists outside of denominational structures, which can be kind of disciplining, right? If you are a Southern Baptist, you can't just go about making up your own kind of messages from God and expect to exist within that hierarchy, right? There's dogma and there's doctrine, and a lot of that dogma and doctrine is, I'm sure, appalling to most of the people in this room. But it does create certain limits. Whereas this movement, which really believes that, they believe that during the time of Christ, there were signs and wonders and apostles and, magic and supernatural gifts. Most Christians, including most evangelicals, believe that a lot of these phenomenon kind of stopped after the time of Christ. But they believe that that we're in a new, as they sometimes put it, a new apostolic moment. There's a part of this movement that I'm sure you're going to hear more about in the course of this conference called the New Apostolic Reformation. This belief in magic and direct messages from the Almighty is really key to that. And a lot of these people, in part because this movement has so much overlap with the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel has always believed that wealth and material gifts are bestowed on believers, so it can be a sign of favor, which makes them, I think, much more likely to see a figure like Donald Trump as potentially holy. Those people have always clustered around Trump from the beginning. And when Donald Trump ultimately became president, those were the people who he brought with them. I mean, there was other people who were very close to Donald Trump who were not part of this movement, other evangelicals who were close to Donald Trump who were not part of this movement, but he really elevated them. You know, his personal pastor, someone he gave a White House job to, was a, I believe thrice divorced, but check me, it could be twice, a prophet named Paula White, who is, you know, a kind of a key figure in this movement and continues to be a key figure in this movement. So this movement was organized in the 90s by a guy named C. Peter Wagner. He was a professor at the Evangelical Fuller Theological Seminary. And he believed, as I said before, he believed that we were in a second apostolic age. And he also incorporated dominion theology into this movement. So on the one hand, you have a movement that believes that it is in that it has this direct line to God. It also has something of a star system because there's no denominational structures. Everybody is competing for the wildest prophecy, you know, the most kind of ecstatic, the most ecstatic expressions of fealty to Donald Trump, the most clever kind of rationalizations of things that Donald Trump does. And so you have this ratchet effect in this movement at the same time as you have this real fundamental conviction that this movement has the right to rule every sector of society. There's an excellent book that came out recently called The Violent Take It by Force about this movement. And the author, Matthew Taylor, writes about prophetic memes. And I think this idea is important because because we're talking about something that's very loose and networked. And, you know, it's not really about doctrines and encyclicals and dogmas. It's about ideas that float around and get grabbed and combined and remixed in these ever kind of escalating new and wild ways. So he talks about prophetic memes, which are constantly circulating. These are flashes of revelation or theological interpretation. And when it comes to Trump, there are two prophetic memes, both originated by a guy named Lance Wallnau, that are really important. The first is called the Cyrus anointing, and this is the notion of Trump as a modern day Cyrus, a kind of pagan king who saves the chosen people. And so you don't expect him to be a believer. You don't even expect him to be, moral. You just need him to be strong. So the idea that Trump is a modern day Cyrus comes from Lance Wallnau. And then maybe even more important is what's called the Seven Mountains Mandate. And if I tell you about the Seven Mountains Mandate, you'll hear a lot of echoes from what Pat Robertson had said. So the Seven Mountains Mandate is the notion that Christians have the right and the obligation to seize the seven mountains of society, which are the home, the church, the schools, government and politics, the media, arts, entertainment, and sports, commerce, science, and technology. So if you go to kind of a Christian nationalist church or listen to a Christian nationalist podcast or go to one of these kind of revivals that are now doubling as Republican campaign rallies, you'll hear references to the seven mountains, even if the kind of theology behind them isn't explicitly laid out. Now, what's starting to happen, well, a couple of things have happened. So the Seven Mountains Mandate, as you can imagine, provided a powerful rationalization for January 6th. And there was, I think, a disproportionate number of people involved in this movement, the New Apostolic Reformation, in the broader world of independent, charismatic Christianity involved in the January 6th insurrection. And in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection, the theology and prophetic memes that have circulated in this milieu have started to spread out and recombine with the broader conservative movement. So what you're seeing now is increasing overlap between this movement and, the militia movement, increasing overlap between this movement and some of the grassroots structures of the Republican Party. I mean, a good example is Charlie Kirk. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Charlie Kirk. He's an extremely influential young conservative. He founded an organization called Turning Point about 12 years ago. And when he founded Turning Point, it was like a secular, libertarian-ish kind of Chicago school right-wing organization that saw high taxes and big government as the greatest of evils. And Charlie Kirk, being a sort of entrepreneurial conservative on the make, saw in the Christian right something of an impediment to his vision because it was repellent to a lot of the people that he wanted to attract. He said it was sanctimonious, that conservatism kind of, couldn't be so stridently anti-gay. But after 2021, after January 6th, I think he saw which way the wind was blowing and has become increasingly entwined with the New Apostolic Reformation. You'll hear, even though I'm not sure, how much his people will say he barely understands this theology, and I believe them. But you'll hear him talk about the Seven Mountains. He does an event every month at a megachurch in Phoenix called Freedom Night in America, which is actually Assemblies of God, which has some overlap. It's Pentecostal as opposed to independent charismatic. We don't need to go into the differences for our purposes, but it's all very kind of aligned in this milieu. And he's working increasingly with Lance Wallnau. And unlike the previous speaker, I don't know how to use PowerPoint. And so, for the first time, I really wish I did, because I wish I could play you a clip of Lance Wallnau reacting to Kamala Harris winning the debate against Donald Trump. But since I can't play it for you, it's floating around the internet if you want to see it. I'm just going to read it to you. Oh, no, she can look presidential. That's the seduction of what I would say is witchcraft. That's the That's the manipulation of imagery that creates an impression contrary to truth, but it seduces you into seeing it. So that spirit, that occult spirit, I believe is operating on her and through her. J.D. Vance, who is running to be Vice President of the United States, is doing an event with Lance Wallnau tomorrow. And I'll conclude with that and take any questions. Thank you.
I'll just step up and say how much I appreciate the New York Times, the Washington Post, and everybody should get a subscription.
Yes, I've always been somewhat concerned about the lack of discussion. When during the Trump administration, they moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and I was thinking, well, wow, this is they're just trying to make the apocalyptic prophecies come to mind. It's all part of that, and I would say that to people, and they look at me like, you're nuts. But do you think that was part of the motivation of moving?
Oh, absolutely.
Moving the embassy to Jerusalem?
Unquestionably, a million %. So this is a little bit complicated because the Christian right that has been kind of dominant until quite recently, the dominant theology is called premillennial dispensationalism, which don't feel like you have to learn how to say that, but they basically believe that there's a series of things that have to happen to kind of precede the rapture. And one of those things is the Jews returning to Israel, at which point there will be, the rise of the Antichrist, the rapture that Tim LaHaye writes about so kind of lasciviously, and kind of horrible apocalyptic war, and eventually the second coming of Christ. And so there has always been this very intense and powerful strain of Christian Zionism, which, whatever you think about the state of Israel, Christian Zionism is not concerned about the well-being of the Jews, since in their kind of ideal scenario, the Jews end up, at least those who don't convert to Christianity, end up there's a fiery apocalypse and they're consigned to hell. But there's an obvious and a kind of extraordinarily cynical overlap between this movement and the broader pro-Israel movement. And, even though, whatever, we can talk about the strength of AIPAC, but Jews in this country are 3% of the population. They can't deliver that many votes, whereas Christians can. And so a lot of the things that Donald Trump did in terms of Israel, it was certainly to please some of his Jewish donors, and you see, for example, the amount of money that Miriam Adelson is giving him, but it was also to reward this larger group of Christian Zionist voters. Now, what's changed a little bit, I think that is still predominant. What's changed a little bit, and I'm honestly a little bit unsure which of these manifestations is worse, is that you've started to see, along with the isolationism that's crept into the conservative movement more broadly, you've started to see more tolerance of open anti-Semitism in the Republican Party more broadly, but also in parts of the Christian right. And so as that becomes more widespread, if that becomes more widespread, the party's relationship to Israel may begin to change. But for now, yes. I think that if you look at sort of all of the reasons that Bibi Netanyahu so badly wants another Donald Trump presidency, it's because Donald Trump, there are very large constituencies in the right-wing coalition for an extraordinarily hawkish policy in the Middle East.
Okay. Can you speak briefly about the Christian nationalist groups in the United States going to Africa, funding African countries for anti-gay policies and such?
Yeah. So when I was writing my second book, which was about women's rights around the world, I went to something called the World Congress of Families. And this is something ironic about both the Christian right and really the kind of nationalist right more broadly, is that they're very, very suspicious of globalism and cosmopolitanism, but they're also quite globalist. In some ways, they're kind of better than liberals at making international connections. So the World Congress of Families was this, the idea behind it initially was that Christians and Muslims actually had, very conservative Christians and very conservative Muslims actually had some common interests on the international stage, particularly with kind of treaties and global agreements that would protect reproductive rights and gay rights. And so they wanted to create these alliances. Now, some of those efforts, especially to create kind of an interfaith religious right, fell apart a little bit after September 11th. But the World Congress of Families and this effort to link up religious fundamentalists from across the world to fight against, homosexuality and feminism, homosexuality and feminism more than anything else, they kept on. There was a lot of links between the American religious right and Russia was very active in the World Congress of Families, and you'll see even until today, Russia will often frame its war against Ukraine as a war against secularism and the homosexual agenda. But one of the people who was sort of in the mix here, a guy named Scott Lively, was very active in Uganda. And when I talked before about independent charismatic churches, this independent charismatic Christianity is the fastest growing movement in American Christianity, but it's also the fastest growing movement in Christianity around the world. And so what you're seeing in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular is this perverse argument that that gay rights or women's rights are sort of colonialist imposition, and that they need to be able to throw them off and express traditional, very conservative African values. And so what you're seeing is that countries that were already extremely anti-gay are becoming more and more anti-gay. And the irony here, again, is that they present this as anti-colonialism, but they are working often quite closely and explicitly with American missionaries and advisors. I remember being in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia when Ethiopia was liberalizing its abortion law, and you saw the same sorts of bloody fetus signs that you see outside of American abortion clinics, and the signs were in English, so you knew where they were coming from.
That's all the time we have for questions. So one more round
I'm
of
sorry,
applause.
that's the last question. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. I think they're going to ship it to me.